The topic that we've had is the overcrowding we're seeing and the high use all over the place. Well, that's the reason why we're all here. I mean, if we didn't have these kind of issues, we'd be probably pretty tickled that we're not dealing with this stuff. But this is a photo I took back around 1980 up at High Camp on Denali. And this was a beautiful evening. And you think, well, geez, are these climbers? And they're just hanging out waiting for the next morning to head to the summit. But it just, to me, it shows the story of a lot of people. They love the mountains, but how many can a mountain bear or mountains bear before we start overcrowding so much? And in the so the roots of clean climbing, and that's when I got my start, was 1975. I came to Denali, and 1974 to Mount Logan in the Yukon. But before that, I grew up in a period of time when the environmental movement, it was coined the environmental movement, which happened around in the early 70s. And there was a person that was spearheading that. His name is Yvon Chouinard, and he coined the word at that point, clean climbing. This is before Leave No Trace was even, there was no name like Leave No Trace out there. But he worked hard at trying to clean up the big walls in Yosemite Valley and other places from what had been going on, and with his equipment sales and other ideas, innovative ideas. And so I would say he's the actual grandfather of this movement, along with other climbers that he climbed with. But he put it out there in like his the clean climbing booklet that he had in the sales of his gear, and a big promotion. And so jumping back to the Alaska range, our first exploration occurred really not that long ago. 1906, the first circumnavigation of the whole Alaska range took place. And of course, the early years, people didn't worry about what they left behind or anything like that. It was more survival in the wilderness. And I'm actually sitting there with a ring of rocks that go around me. And that is the actual site of the Brown Cook expedition that came into the Alaska range. And there was just, I didn't go dig around the rocks because it's a wilderness area, but this actually was a site they used for their tent. And it's probably the first evidence of a climbing group that we had in Denali National Park that we could find. But in my earliest years, in the 70s and 80s, even the 60s, everyone that climbed pretty much just left gear behind. And the park tried to advocate packing stuff out, but that really didn't happen. And unfortunately, this still occurs in a lot of places of the world. Luckily, in the Alaska range, we have, it just doesn't happen that often. And we really work hard trying to prevent this from, but like Dawa was saying, trash for cash, I mean, those are the incentives. And it seems to me that climbers are doing a pretty good job, guide companies are doing a pretty good job at policing themselves today, not wanting to see this. But I think if you come into a place that's absolutely clean, you don't really want to leave something behind and to trash it yourself. So if you go to a place that's completely trashed, you tend to leave something behind then. But the dilemma that was probably the hardest to solve, when you have greater numbers of people, you get the issues of human waste. And that's what I've probably spent 20 years trying to figure this thing out, or maybe 30 years working on that. And that's the big reason why this conference is here today, or why I'm involved with it, is because of the waste dilemma. And these are scenes from in the Alaska range and high up on Denali. Some are quite a few years back, others are very recent. And it's people have to go. And so what do we do about it? Well, this guy, Gary Grimm, was the first person to do something about it. In 1973, he brought all of his human waste off his climb in Denali. And he also started to spearhead a movement, not coined the clean climb movement at the time, but he started a campaign to clean up the mountains on Denali and other big mountains. And I got involved with that. And it was, as you see, from the University of Oregon's outdoor program. And essentially, Oregon was kind of the green place at that time. And I was very fortunate to be raised right there in the middle of all that and get my early climbing years with this mentality, which I've carried on to the rest of my life. And so that standard, we really got going in the 70s and 80s with just removing all garbage that was possible. And we got the Denali National Park on board the same way. And they today are, it's just part of the protocol. You know, nothing gets left behind. I was involved in research, independent research, in 1977 on attitudes, and also part of the Denali Rehabilitation and Education Project. And so we actually had early research on people's attitudes with human waste, with the abandoned equipment, crowding, rescues, access, all the issues that you find in places all over the world today. And I think we were the forefront of some of this way back in 1977. So that essentially 40 years ago. So the easiest solution at the time, especially in a heavy snow environment, was to dig pit latrines. And that really cleaned up the sites essentially to make them to where you didn't find contaminated snow. Unfortunately, the snow in Alaska range melts very, very fast. And it doesn't take long for these latrines to surface on a heavy melt year. And unfortunately, whatever gets put on the glacier ice tends to remain there and move down glacier. And we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. The next step is well, let's get this further into the glacier surface by crevassing it. So in the mid-'80s, we thought, well, let's try to convince people to use plastic bags and go in a plastic bag and then toss those in crevasses. And unfortunately, that's kind of stayed the pattern even today. The Clean Mountain can on Denali, 90% of the waste from that gets crevassed till today in certain crevasses. We actually mark the crevasses, and that gets carried down. Unfortunately, it could be all carried off, and we'll be talking more about that here in a few minutes. Other things, other campaigns from the year 2000, we did a fuel. We had a lot of fuel cans left on the mountain, and the climbers on Denali primarily used the small cartridges or full 1-gallon cans like this one being hauled up by a guide. And they really become, what it is people leave like, well, I've got a third of a can of gas still left. Well, a lot of times these would get left behind just because they thought someone else would want to use it. So what we did, we started marking. We did a research project on marking cans and how many would return. It was done by a graduate student, and it turned out really fast that essentially 25% of the groups left their fuel cans behind. Even though they were supposed to pack out all their garbage, they didn't look at the fuel as garbage. We also started a campaign or a study with how much waste do people generate per person per day. And so that's what this is we wanted to, and that's what that little booklet that I passed out was based on so if a group comes down with, say, just a small Ziploc bag of garbage for their 21-day trip, that couldn't possibly be all their garbage. Well, it wasn't. And now we have the legal authority to actually cite that group or give them a citation if they don't bring back an adequate amount of garbage. But we do know that climbers, no matter how well you organize your food, end up generating a fair amount. And so all that has to be brought off. So today, what occurs is with the private groups is we do spot checks of people's garbage when they get back down to the landing strip. Luckily, with Denali, we have just almost all the climbers fly in, so we have easy point of entry and an easy point coming out. Now, the rest of the Alaska Range, it's not so simple. We have a dozen other airstrips all over, and so those are much harder to police, and so it really comes back again to getting climbers to participate and bringing everything out, and it's been working pretty darn good. Again, the human waste dilemma. In the year 2000, and this is a picture of me up on the left, I decided to see how hard it would be to bring off all of our climbers' waste that year. And there wasn't, and I needed to bring it off in something rather than a plastic bag. As you know, climbers have a lot of sharp points, and if you're hauling around big bags of your human waste, you're going to step on them, you're going to hit them with something sharp. It's just, it's not going to be a good situation. And so what I did was I ended up taking up Denali 3 big ammo boxes that are used on river trips. And we pretty much filled those things up. But they were heavy, very awkward, and nothing that anybody would ever use, except I wanted to see how hard it would be to bring our waste off. And we were able to accomplish that on that trip. And so that convinced me that waste could be brought off. I found an outfit that could clean these things. And so that's where the American Alpine Club, again, helped out. And so they provided the money, and I'm over down here on the bottom corner. The 51st little Clean Mountain cans that the American Alpine Club purchased, and we pretty much passed those out to climbers in the year 2001 to see if we could convince them to bring back their waste. And that year we were able to get, I think it was like 23 groups of people to try to bring back their waste. We even had people, even on hard climbs like Mount Huntington, that brought back all their waste, which was pretty cool. But it started working that way. And then the Alpine Club realized, well, that's pretty neat. So let's give you some more money and let's buy a whole bunch of cans. So that over the next couple of years, we ended up with 400. They bought 400 cans, and the Access Fund joined in. We had 400 gray ones, different prototypes, and so that really kicked off the campaign. And it wasn't long before climbers everywhere wanted to use these cans, and it was a simple means of moving the waste. They're not very heavy, as you can see, passing that one around, but they are a secure way and a safe way to transport waste without getting it all over your gear. And so today, just 2 years ago, I convinced the staff that of Denali's staff to try to, let's convince all the, we couldn't put in a regulation or anything, but let's try to get all the other waste brought off of the Alaska Range brought out. And so, so we started advocating bringing all the waste out from the low glacier airstrips, which essentially are just plane camping. You fly in, you set up a base camp, you're there for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, a month. And so we figured out how many of these Clean Mountain cans you would need for each group, and today it's working out incredibly well. I would say over 90% of the waste is being brought out voluntarily from all the climbers that are going into all the peaks around the Alaska Range. And I really commend all those people that are doing that, because they're just doing it because it's the right thing to do, and it's very simple. And so that's where we kind of stand with that today. Again, convincing people, like the earliest part of this is how do we have to be able to convince the pilots that fly this to handle the waste, and the buy-in took a couple years, but today all the pilots are convinced this is the right thing to do. We have quite a few, there's quite a few air taxis that fly the climbers in and out of the range, and they're all used now, this many years later, they're all used to moving the waste, and it's no big deal to transport the waste because the container has proven that it works well. But none of this would be possible without support of our guide companies. Half the climbers up on Denali and in the Alaska Range are guided, and these are the companies that, and through the American Mountain Guides Association, are the ones that are working on Denali. We have a limited number, in some ways that works out really well because they police themselves. And they are, I would say, these guide companies are by far the cleanest companies. They even beat the Park Service out in their clean methods. They each try to show each other up. And so and this next year, a bunch of them are going to be bringing all their waste off of Denali, which will be the first for any in large numbers of guide companies. So Dawa's been doing it, and but it's Denali. Again, each area is different, and each has its own difficulties of moving waste from different elevations, and the quantity. It's not an easy situation to deal with the waste. But again, climbers' waste is only 1/4 of the weight of what you're bringing up. So, and going downhill is a lot easier than carrying it all up. So once you've gotten rid of your fuel and your food, it's only 1/4 to bring it back. And so the campaign that's taken place, it's climbers policing each other, and the Park Service putting in some regulations about where the waste, what has to be brought off, when and where. We don't really cite too many people that aren't doing this, but I think more of it is climbers are looking after each other, and when you have people doing this, they're convinced, if I'm doing it, then you have to be doing it. And they turn other climbers in that are not. And so it's amazing how well the system has worked. We put out a little logo last year to keep Denali clean, no can, no climb. And that's on top of every CMC, so you can't go up the mountain. You can't climb Denali without your clean mountain can now. So they all know this when they arrive. But the dilemma is we still have a lot of waste being generated. And again, we have just 1,200 climbers, maybe a little less per year that are climbing on Denali. We have another 500 to 1,000 that are climbing the Alaska range. Of all those, we're probably generating in pounds about 5,000, which is a fair amount. And so we've done research now. We've had University of Alaska, University of Alaska, Alaska Pacific University, excuse me. Mike Loso has done research. He's continuing research as we speak. And it's with these points that I put up here, what is happening to this waste inside the glaciers, how fast is it moving down the glaciers, and how long will it take to reach the surface, and will the waste still be active with the pathogens once it's surfaced? And pretty much we've answered all those questions. It's moving very quickly, even in our large glaciers. In some of the places it's moving a meter a day down. How long will it take? Right now we're looking at about 2020 for it to start surfacing, a lot of this waste, and it is contaminating some of the outwash streams. A very faint amount of contamination is occurring right now, and we're talking about glaciers that are over 40 miles long. These are some pictures from research this year. What we did is we wanted to find out what is happening with the bags the climbers are throwing into the glacier. So what we did is we actually polluted a spot. We went down 2/3 of the way down the Kiltna Glacier and dug down to the bottom ice in the picture down the lower right, and put in 50 pounds of human waste in the bags, and with temperature probe, GPS location, and tracking it to see what's happening with that. And it wasn't a month later before it was on the surface here and dispersing out. And I know these bags don't break down fast because I already done the research on that. But this is the waste after it's surfaced, and it is absolutely terrible. And that will take a while. It'll be interesting to see this little pile, how fast this breaks down over the course of the next year or two. But luckily we're doing this research right now, and I know that's going to convince the park management of Denali to say, well, we need to be bringing all this waste off. So here are some pictures from Mike Loso's research. The red dots are stakes that were out there on the velocity or the movement of the ice going down, and the blue ones are the water sample locations. But there's nothing else other than climbers that waste is coming down a tremendous distance and coming out to the bottom of the glacier. This is the Giltna. It's about 5 kilometers across at the bottom, and it's huge. It's a huge piece of ice, so this stuff is taking, but it's already reaching the bottom and the contamination. So we're going to be seeing that, who knows, for the next 100 years, contamination going on by climbers in Denali National Park, which is kind of sad to think. And we have the same thing. We haven't done research, but we have the same issue with some of our other glaciers where climbers have been. The Ruth Glacier is one. Also glaciers in Little Switzerland. Places where climbers have been have had toilets for years. So, we're faced with this this pollution that is not going to go away for a long time. But it's time that we deal with it as best we can. And so here are the Clean Mountain cans today. And to try to do a lower carbon footprint than what we do now, I've done some research, and that was in the vermicomposting. So currently the waste, these cans get brought off. They're actually in that cage back behind this fella. Back behind him, you see a little cage. Well, those are all Clean Mountain cans that are dirty back in there. And he just has cleaned all these, has brought them back, and they'll be recycled back. But currently the Clean Mountain cans we have, they've lasted from 2001 to present, and we haven't retired a single one. Occasionally they get lost or broken, primarily broken when you have incredibly cold conditions, like 30 below, and you're getting a big windstorm, snowstorm. Your Clean Mountain can that you've been using is outside of your tent, on the sides of your tent or whatever, and you're out there trying to dig the snow away from your tent, and you hit it with a sharp shovel. Well, when it's 30 below, plastics get kind of brittle, and so it's easy to bust the side of a Clean Mountain can if you're digging hard. But generally, they've held up very well. We've had some dropped over 1,000 feet, and they were put right back into service. So they're a tough little container, but the big problem is making sure they're cleaned properly, and so we had to go through some hurdles to make sure that they're sanitized properly so they can be recycled time and year and year and year and year. Some of these cans get used twice or 3 times a season by the climbing groups and brought back this way. But unfortunately, the carbon footprint's fairly large. They get hauled down a long ways from Talkeetna, our base operations, and then brought back. And so my thought was, well, why don't we figure out a way to do this locally? And Jeff Hill, who will be showing a video of his on vermicomposting a little later today with regular toilets, convinced me to do this project with climbers' waste. And so, and that's the flyer I gave you. It gives you all the details about that research that I did. Here's just a few pictures from that, but in the short of it all, I took climbers' waste and composted it with worms, which is the lower left picture, added a whole bunch of worms to that, and gosh, within 3 months, 90% of the waste was destroyed. But it did take a full 2 years to destroy all the pathogens in the end. And I took constant samples to see what was happening with it, and that's the top right picture. And in the end, I'm pouring the waste out, and it was absolutely free from pathogens, pouring it out on our raspberries in Talkeetna, Alaska, but in the fall. But the research I did, though, can be used anywhere in the world. This is a cold climate that I did the research in, and I purposely did this research this project could be taken anywhere, and if you kind of follow the same parameters, you could do it here at Mount Cook Park, you could do it in the villages, in high mountain areas, whether it's the Andes or Nepal, wherever it has just a little bit of warmth. But worms are pretty darn tough, and I had them above ground, so they would freeze in the winter. Most of them died, but then there are worms that survive too, and it was a very successful project, very simple and practically no cost at all. The cost was in actually doing the samples, having to send those off, and they were kind of spendy. But what I've felt for the past, since when I started doing the research into figuring out how to deal with the climber's waste, there was no networking going on anywhere in the world. It drove me nuts. And different people had done different things. And so around 2004, I got in my head that it would be really neat to put together a conference of like-minded thinkers on dealing with the waste problem. And it took quite a few years to pull it together, but the first conference, Exit Strategies, occurred in 2010. I even flew to Japan and talked to UI's General Assembly in Japan, trying to promote the idea, and actually got a few takers on that. But today we're here today, and as you see with the different conferences that have been held, but a lot of this has to do with American Alpine Club support, Access from early support, UIAA, and now they've taken over Respect the Mountains, which I respect this organization trying to make that happen in Europe. Leave No Trace is a huge global campaign with a lot of great ideas, and so the collaboration is the key thing here, and it's pretty neat. So it's just great that we have a room full of like-minded people like yourselves wanting to reach solutions to these problems. And so where do we go? Like Dawa's thing, what's the future? And I feel it is carry it all out, or pack it all out. Leave pretty much just your tracks, possibly some urine. I'm working on that one too right now. But that's what it really comes down to, is just leaving very little evidence that you were there, and it's totally doable. If people can do that in high mountains like on Denali, there's no reason why we can't. This picture here, is Dr. Nima here? Oh yeah, over here. Yeah, his hand's raised. Okay, he is the fellow standing up here, top left, with his hand on top of the CMC. This group of Nepali climbers arrived in Talkeetna this summer to climb Denali, and somehow I convinced them to take all their waste off Denali. And so this is the picture taken before they left. They each had a Clean Mountain can, and I didn't know if they were going to be able to do this or not. Ang Lama, here to the far right, kind of the main leader of the overall group, he has his own personal CMC and was convinced they could probably pull it off. Well, sure enough, they got their waste back off when they got back down. But they were the first foreign group ever to bring their waste off Denali, which is pretty darn commendable, and I applaud Dr. Nima here and the team to do this. It's pretty darn neat. But again, I want to thank the American Alpine Club. They've been my sponsor for this trip, and also the Access Fund, who has been a supporter all along of clean practices in the Alaska Range.